In the trunk of a car. I stepped out of my motel room, keys clattering in my hands as I fumbled with the lock. It was a cool summer's night and the stars glittered above the lonely parking lot. A light breeze rustled my hair, bringing with it the smell of cooked steaks from a nearby barbecue. As I stepped towards my car, I heard the sound of a footstep from the nearby alley. I nearly jumped at the noise. "Hello?" I said nervously. No one answered. And just as I was about to make a dash for my car, I noticed movement from the corner of my eye. A dark figure had suddenly leapt out from the corner. I felt a sharp blow. Stars danced across my vision, and the last thing I remember seeing was the ground rapidly approaching as I fell. I awoke to total darkness when I at last opened my eyes. The ground vibrated gently beneath me. I tried to move but found that I couldn't, no matter how hard I tried. My arms and legs were bound tightly behind my back. I tried to scream, but my mouth was gagged. I wriggled and bumped my head against a wall. My feet were pressed right up against another, and all that I could smell was dust and petrol. With a twinge of terror, I realized that I was trapped in the trunk of a car. From the sound of the engine, I could make out that the car was on the highway, and I could hear other cars passing by on the right. I became numb with disbelief. Tears began to well in my eyes. I remembered hearing people talk about two young women who had gone missing from the area in the last 2 months, and I wondered if it wasn't the same person who now had me. The weight of reality came crashing down upon me. I felt paralyzed with fear, unable to even imagine what fate awaited me when at last the car came to a stop. I felt my bonds. My hands were shackled tight and didn't budge no matter how hard I tried to squeeze out. My ankles were tied. My fingers could just barely reach the knot and would slip each time I tried to tug on it with how tightly it was fastened. Tears streamed down my cheeks and puddled onto the carpeted floor. I didn't know what to do. I felt hopeless, unable to do anything to stop this horrible fate that seemed impending now. I cursed myself for not being more cautious. For wanting to go out tonight when I knew all too well about the disappearances. My breathing became labored as very little oxygen was able to get through the rag. Against my better judgment, I began to hyperventilate. I couldn't stop, and worried that I just might pass out. And then I heard it. The faint whine of a police siren. At once my breathing controlled itself. I suddenly felt hope spring from my chest. I felt the car slow and heard the crunching of gravel as it pulled over to the side of the road. And then it stopped. The purr of the engine died. All became still. I stared out into the darkness, straining my ears for even the slightest of noise. In the distance, I heard a car door slam shut. And then there was the crinkling footsteps of the officer on the gravel. I held my breath and waited until the officer was at the driver's side door. "Do you know why I pulled you over tonight?" I could hear the muted voice of the officer say. There came a muffled response from the driver, too quiet to hear. "Your right tail light's broken. Could I see some ID and registration please?" Now was my chance. I screamed. I screamed as loud as I could into the rag. It sounded little more than a soft moan. "How long's it been out?" I heard the officer say. I screamed louder, moving around as I did. I lifted my heels as high as they would go and as hard as I could, I hit them against the floor of the car. At last, I heard a response. "What was that?" the officer said. I made out no word from the driver. I performed the routine again, twisting my body so that the tip of my heels were just able to kick the lid of the trunk. "Sir, is there something in the trunk of your car?" the officer asked. I felt my heart lift with joy as I kicked again and again at the hatch. "All right, I need you to just stay where you are." And then I heard the footsteps of the policeman get near. I could feel his presence on the other side of the lid. There was the soft rustle of his fingers along the hatch as they moved to lift the handle. But then I heard the driver's side door open. "Sir, I told you to stay where you are." I felt a horrible unease in my chest. Suddenly, the officer shouted. "Sir," it was cut short by a loud bang as a gunshot rang throughout the night. I heard the body of the policeman slam against the trunk, and then onto the ground. I tried not to make a sound. My mind was buzzing with the noise, as though it echoed inside my skull. The sound of the officer's scream played on loop over and over in my mind, as the feeling of safety slowly died with it. The driver's door slammed shut. The car was alive again in a second, and soon the engine rose to a roar. I could hear the honks of car horns, just blips of noise as we sped past them, now moving much faster than we had before. I tried with my fingertips to undo the knot. Each time they slipped. My nails chipped as I tried to pinch the end of the rope. Eventually I was able to wiggle a piece of it loose, but still the knot did not weaken. I kicked at it, crying in frustration. My ankles were becoming sore from the rope rubbing against them, but still I squirmed. Eventually the car turned, and I could hear the rough rumble of dirt road beneath. The car moved just as quickly, flying over potholes that rattled my body. In the distance, I could hear the faint whines of police sirens, and I prayed that they were following us. That they weren't on their way to the scene of the shooting and had instead seen how erratically the car was driving. But the sirens soon faded into nothingness. I pinched more at the knot, grunting as I pulled out at it, trying to create an opening that my feet could slither out of. I kicked off my shoes, and with great strain managed to get the knot around my heel. I felt skin tear as I eventually pulled it all the way over, and with great relief, I managed to wiggle my feet out. There was a bump, and I heard the rumble of the dirt road shift to the gentle rustle of grass. We were off-road. Perhaps in a field. For the first time that night, I heard the voice of the driver. He didn't seem to be talking to me, but rather to himself. It began as a mumble but rose until I could make out his voice. His voice was hoarse, and he spoke in a language I didn't recognize. There was rhythm to what he was saying, as though he were chanting something. My blood curdled at the noise. I didn't need to hear it to know that he was out of his mind, but the chanting still unnerved me as I realized his intentions might be even more mad than I thought. Eventually, the car came to a stop. I heard the man get out. I heard him call out to someone, and I wondered if there wasn't two of them. I refrained from making any noise, afraid to draw his attention to the trunk of the car. There were still the sounds of sirens, but they were a long way out. I heard him call out again. And then, the chanting resumed. There was the rustle of his footsteps, and I listened as they drew near. He walked softly along the side of the car. I could hear the jingling of keys. Something metallic tapped against the sides of the trunk as he moved along the length, and I wondered if it wasn't a dagger or the muzzle of his gun, toying with me. I readied myself. At the first sign of the door opening, I resolved to lash out with a savage kick. He would likely not have expected that I had freed myself of my bonds. It would be my only hope to catch him off guard. There were still the sounds of faraway sirens. And as I heard the keys dig into the lock, I realized that they were getting closer. The man stopped. And with a breath of relief, I heard him retreat to the driver's side door. I nearly cried for joy as I heard the rustle of car tires in the grass. The sirens were screaming now. The man was fumbling with something up front. I heard the sounds of more officers screaming, "Hands on your head. Get down. Now." There was a gunshot, immediately followed by many more firing at once. I heard a ting as a hole opened up inches from my head, and light at last spilled into the trunk. I screamed as loud as I could. "There's someone in here." I wanted to shout. I kicked at the latch again and again, hoping that someone would notice. In the light that spilled from the bullet hole, I could now make out the trunk in its entirety. For the first time, I noticed that there were other things inside with me. I noticed candles and texts with what looked like ancient runes scrawled across them. And in the far right, I could make out the lifeless sockets of a human skull staring directly at me. "Man down," I heard an officer say. "Sir, do you hear something?" said another. "Sir, there's someone inside the car," said a third. I continued to scream at the top of my lungs until the rustling of grass from at least a half-dozen people was all that I could hear. "Hello? Is someone in there? Stay calm. We'll have you out in a minute." There was the scraping of tools against the latch, until there was a click and the lid swung open. I was blinded by the headlights from the squad cars, but squinting I could see at least 3 silhouettes standing over me. I nearly cried from joy. "Easy now," said one as they helped me out of the trunk. I was escorted towards the police cars, my hands still shackled behind my back. I could barely walk from the burns on my ankles and had to be carried by the 2 men. We were in a field, at the edge of a dark, evergreen forest. The body of the man was lying by the driver's side door, 2 bloody holes in his chest. His face I couldn't see past the tall grass. And then, in the confusion of all the officers shouting and the blaring sirens, I found myself looking over to the forest's edge. I saw 2 red eyes glaring back at me from between the trees. Whatever they belonged to had to be about 8 feet tall, and as my eyes adjusted, I could just make out the glimmer of 2 long, white fangs, before the police car door was opened and I was placed inside. I heard a low growl beneath the sound of everything else that was going on, before the eyes blinked one last time and then disappeared from sight. No one but me seemed to notice in the confusion. Police would go on to find the bones of 2 humans in the area around the forest with signs of animal bite marks all over them. They believed that the killer brought them to this spot so that their bodies would be picked apart by a pack of wolves that might have lived in the woods. But I suspect that there was something more sinister than a wolf that the man was taking me to visit that night, as much as I would rather not believe.